about a changing world order, what do we actually mean? Well, the foundation of the world order was obviously the situation that prevailed at the end of the Second World War, 1945. And the world order started changing actually within a few years. And within a few years, in a set of events in which your own university had a very big role, which was the independence of India. That as India became independent, as it triggered the independence of other countries, the decolonization process set into motion the first big changes in the world order. And the more it unfolded, obviously, the more the order changed. But at its heart, at the core, the order was still the same. There were five very powerful countries, which, in many ways, by different methods, wielded a lot of influence. And in the initial years, if you look at 50s and 60s, there were countries who were politically independent, but not economically independent. And therefore, even the political independence was very, very limited by that factor. Now, after a few decades, the next set of forces in the changing world order started, which was the economic changes. The economic changes in terms of new centers of production and consumption. And you saw East Asia, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia take the lead, followed by China. Then there was a gap, in my view, a very costly gap of about 15 years, where India also started to reform. So you had the first wave of political changes, the second wave of economic changes. Then there were some very special issues, like the nuclear issue, because the five countries who really dominated the world were all nuclear powers, and they had made a treaty which said only we five will be nuclear powers. So the nuclear changes started after another 20 years. So you had by the 1998 nuclear test, which Prime Minister Vajpayee authorized, you had the nuclear changes come into being. But there were changes which were also happening in a way beyond our control. They were not necessarily triggered by us. We participated in them. And I would say we benefited by some of them. Maybe we also had some damage from some part of it. And those were the globalization changes. So if you looked from the 1990s, the spread of technology, greater mobility, businesses going to other countries. And so the political, the economic, the nuclear, the globalization, by the time we reached the beginning of this century, the world was actually beginning to look very, very different. But the world is habitual, like people are. Nobody changes habits unless they are compelled to change habits. You don't like getting up early, nobody can make you get up early unless you have a class which forces you to get up early. So the action forcing event was the global financial crisis of 2008. At that stage, the Western countries, there was a group called G7, which were all Western countries of Europe and North America. They realized they could not handle this crisis on their own. They needed a China in the conversation, they needed a Japan. Japan was part of it, they needed a Korea, they definitely needed an India. And the G7 became the G20. That same G20 which is also going to come to Kashi this next summer. Now, that was one example of a change. But once change started, it went in different directions, not always in a very predictable manner. So you had new groupings, you had new institutions. So there was something like the BRICS, there was something like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. A few years before, you had something like the Quad. So the change started throwing up new groupings, new practices, new institutions, new ideas. But in all of this, there were some countries who were rising. They were rising by themselves, obviously in relationship with the world, but their national power started to make a big difference to the overall global situation. I would say the most impactful has been the rise of China. After that, with a gap, not maybe at the same pace, has been the rise of India. There are some others also who are in that pathway. And as a consequence, the overall influence of the West in the global order has come down. The West is still a very dominant force, but if you were to say, compare it to 1945, 55, 65, 75, today in 2022, obviously the economic share of the West, the political influence, the military reach, all these are not as dominant as they used to be before. There were two other factors which I think is important for us to understand the change. One, today the enormous role played by technology. That technology, people say, this term data is new oil. Data actually means technology. That technology is today a key factor in balance of power, the way military capabilities used to be, soldiers used to be, or weapons used to be before. And on the world itself, my final point, which is that the result of all of this is today what we have the beginnings of what is called the multipolar world, many centers of power. So it's not too like it used to be in the Cold War. There are many more, and the general expectation of the world is that India too will be in the coming years one of the poles of the world. So that is the state of the world. Now let us look how did India fare during this period. So that brings me to again asking this question. We speak about the rise of India. What do we mean by the rise of India? Well, you will say the most obvious is the economic rise. Today, India is the fifth largest economy in the world. Probably in the space of the next few years, become the third largest economy in the world. Yes, that is absolutely correct, but it's only part of the answer. India is also, when you say rise of India, today India is much more dominant regionally. Many of you, I say this to the students, would be surprised that there was an era that when I was your age in a university, the world actually used to see India and Pakistan on equal terms. Today, nobody does, not even the Pakistanis. So the fact that we have clearly today come out in that region as the primary power. Obviously, we have neighbors, we have to, and I will speak about that, we have to have very strong and positive relationships with them. But it isn't just in power terms, it is in economic terms, it is in trade terms, it is in mobility terms, how people move amongst each other. And there's no question today India is the sort of focus, the fulcrum of this region. Another expression of the rising India is actually our political stature. Now, political stature could mean we are members of more organizations. We are today members of the Security Council. This is our last month of this presidency. Hopefully, in some years, we'll be back in the Security Council. There are many, export control groups that we have joined, many new groupings of which we are members. But it is also our ability to shape the global agenda. That has also become more visible. If you look today at the big discussions in the world, what happens when leaders meet to discuss climate change, or black money, or tax rates, or terrorism, or maritime security. What India says, what India advocates, what India influences actually is more and more visible. I spoke about new groups of which India is a member, which too is a reflection of our higher standing. The most prominent of that is Quad. There's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And very recently, last year, we started something with Israel, UAE, and America called I2U2. There are new institutions. And by the way, many of these institutions are institutions which the idea came from India. In fact, many of them came personally from the Prime Minister. We have the International Solar Alliance. We have the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We are now, just a few months ago, we had a campaign, a mission called Lifestyle for Environment, which is Prime Minister's very strong belief that if we all changed our lifestyle, if we change everyday lifestyle in a very sensible manner, we will make a huge difference to the environment. So there are today a whole set of institutions, ideas, campaigns that are coming out of India. The fact that the world accepts it, and not just accepts it. Today, Solar Alliance, for example, has more than 100 countries who are members of it. So that shows you something as well. Then there is the impact of the diaspora. Uh, Today in the world, there are something like between 32 to 34 million people in the world, 3.2 to 3.4 crores, who are either of Indian origin or who are Indians. And we today are playing an increasingly important role in the global workplace. And these Indians, when they go out and their success stories, they shape the image of India. And when the world, for example, looks at the rise of India, for them the contribution and successes of the diaspora is part of the story of the rise of India. So that is something which is very important. But equally, we too have a responsibility we didn't have earlier. If so many Indians live abroad, it's our duty to look after them. When the COVID happened, one of our big discoveries was really how many Indians worked abroad. You'd really be surprised how many people there were in the shipping industry, merchant shipping, how many people were working in cruise liners, how many air crew there were in different airlines, how many people had gone as construction workers in the Gulf, how many people had gone as temporary tech support workers across Europe and America. So the what we did there, which was the biggest ever evacuation mission in the history of the world, we brought back almost 7 million people. So just think to yourself, these 7 million people, if they are our asset and strength to the country in the good times, the country too has that responsibility of looking after them in the tough times. There may be people like this, but there are also students. You would have brothers and sisters and cousins and friends who would have chosen to go abroad. And they too are our responsibility. Today we have 1 million students abroad, 1 million Indian nationals abroad as students. And that too, looking after them, which you saw that we did that in Ukraine. That too is a responsibility. But this is part of the rise of India, because for the rest of the world, they can see India's presence. They can see India's presence among their own society, as students, as doctors, as tech people, as I said, as all these service providers. So the cumulative impact of this on the world is actually huge. Then there are some parts of India which come out of our capabilities. One obvious one, of course, is the IT side. But the IT side, 10 years, 15 years ago, it used to be India as the back office of the world. That too is changing. Today, India and Indians are increasingly seen as innovators. I was in the US a few months ago, and you may have, some of you may have followed that today there's a big competition going on in chips in the semiconductor industry. And a representative of the American semiconductor industry told me that American companies, by his account, had at least 40,000 engineers working on chip design alone in India. So you have to imagine today, what does the world think about us? The world sees that talent, world sees that skill. The world is trying to integrate it into their business and supply chain models. Another example is the image of India as the pharmacy of the world. As foreign minister, I still travel 20, 25 times, even during COVID, for reasons of work. And I cannot tell you today how much our image in the world has changed because of vaccine Maitri. That there are countries, I've had ministers say in public, in say Central America, that there were centers of production of vaccine closer to us, but yet we got our vaccines from India. So the fact that we were still vaccinating our people and yet willing to share vaccines at that time, the fact that we could actually increase our pharmaceutical capacity, sometimes 3x, 5x, 10x, depending on the medicines. There was at that time during COVID, I was also part of the group of ministers dealing with the COVID response. There was a huge demand for paracetamol. And our paracetamol production, actually our industry, was able to ramp it up phenomenally. And we actually really at that time were meeting the global demand of paracetamol from our factories in India. So when I speak of the rise of India, I wanted to illustrate to you, it is not a phrase in international relations. There are physical indices, there are actual experiences, there are sort of, I would say, relationships, transactions, impact on people's lives, which is what make them feel that India is not what the India of the past used to be. So what could we do more? How do we rise faster as the world changes? And I have a few thoughts here. If you ask me to sum it up in a single phrase, I would say if India could really become a successfully Atmanirbhar Bharat, it will help us enormously in our rise. For this reason, a big country like India needs deep strengths. It cannot be vulnerable to other countries for its basic requirements. Because we saw during COVID, when other parts of the world shut down, the problems that it created in India. So the more that we are able to do, and again, this is not an advocacy of protectionism. No country today can be, fully self-sufficient. That era is over. But the more we develop our strengths, the more we will have an importance in the world, because we will be relevant to the rest of the world. The second part of it is, how do we ourselves develop those strengths? And there I would say, especially with the COVID experience, there are three big domains where I would underline to you that big changes are happening in society, changes that are driven by the vision of the Prime Minister and the government. One is digital. There is a huge digital revolution, and I use the word revolution very, very consciously, in this country. But if you see the digital delivery which is happening on a scale which the rest of the world is just staggered by the numbers and by the services we do. The second is the green growth. That if we have to grow, and we are growing 7%, 8%, we must grow greener and greener. Because the cost of not going green will be to undo the growth to get better growth. So in a sense, we have the advantage because we are a relatively late grower. We have many technologies which were not there earlier. So how do we grow more greenly? And the third, of course, is our health and our human indices, which is from the time babies are born, maybe even before. How do we improve the quality of health, quality of our human resources, quality of our skills, of our talents, of our education? Because at the end of the day, India's greatest resource is its people. There are countries who have done, who live on mining, who live on oil, who live on other resources. Our resources eventually are people. And this is particularly important because we are moving into an age of knowledge economy. And in a knowledge economy, the power of the brain will be bigger than the power of everything else. So the more we are able to improve the quality of human resources, actually you are building India. So when they say that universities are nation builders, as your Vice Chancellor did, believe me, take it literally. That it is actually today the quality of our universities which is going to determine India's standing in the world as much as the quality of our military or the quality of our diplomacy. The second, of course, is in our own neighborhood. I would say after 2014, we have fundamentally changed the manner we work. We have decided what we call neighborhood first policy, that we would engage all our neighbors very proactively, but barring one who has a particular problem. but engage most of our neighbors and engage them in a way in which it will be generous, it will be non-reciprocal. We want to build connectivity, long-term relationships, contacts, mobility. The third, of course, depending our prospects would depend how we face up to the challenge from China, because as you can see on the border, there is a challenge, and there's no getting away from that. The fourth is a challenge we've had for many, many years, which is the challenge of cross-border terrorism. So how do we delegitimize terrorism? Because the issue is not vis-a-vis a country. The issue is vis-a-vis a phenomenon. Because if that phenomenon were not to happen, then the country is not an issue. So the real challenge for us is how do you make a country addicted to terrorism to give up that practice? The fifth is that we need to become a bigger maritime power because today a very large part of the global trade is moving through the Indian Ocean, and a large part of ours is moving through the Pacific Ocean. So the bigger we get economically, the more will be our stakes, and it's important both for our own interests and for global interests that we do that. As I said, we need to become a technology power because of the knowledge economy. We need to remain an independent power because finally the world will respect a country which stands up for itself, which has its own well-defined interests, which is able to articulate them. So how do you maintain your independence in a very polarized world where there are strong debates and high passions? At the same time, how do you work with other countries? Because you can remain independent and isolated, but that is bad diplomacy. In this, in this very complex world, everybody needs friends and partners. So how do we find friends and partners with whom we are willing to work? And in the past, to use a phrase of the Prime Minister, there have been hesitations of history. We were reluctant to work with countries. The obvious example is the US, even though there were a lot of shared interests. So how do we develop the confidence to be independent and yet have the ability to work with others? Then, of course, there is the issue of, to my mind, of how do we project our culture more strongly, because projecting our heritage and culture today is essential in a world where a large part of the contestation is a battle of ideas. It is, who defines rights and wrongs, what is right and wrong, what is the norm, what is not the norm. These are today increasingly big issues in the global debates. And finally, for a country like India, given our history, I think it's particularly important that we continuously strengthen our national unity, because in the past, if you look at our history, that has been a point of weakness. So, very briefly, as I said, I've given you a sense of the changing world, the rise of India, what can make India rise more. And I'll finish with a few words on the G20. As I said, the G20 presidency has already started. It is an exceptional responsibility. It is an exceptional responsibility because these are the 20 most powerful, most impactful, most influential countries in the world. And whoever has the chair of that grouping has that ability to set the agenda, to shape the directions, to influence the debates. So it is a responsibility, but if well used, it is also an opportunity. The second point I would make is it's an exceptional responsibility, but it is happening at an exceptional time. Because today's world is, by any standards, exceptionally difficult. We are seeing the impact of the COVID, economic, financial crises, which started, some of it even before the COVID, the impact of the Ukraine war, the polarization of the Ukraine war, the more and more climate events, continuing terrorism. So this is a tough time. It's a tough world. So how do you take more responsibility in tough times? That is something which I think this country has to face up to. But it's an exceptional responsibility in exceptional times, but which I assure you will be handled exceptionally. because typically countries do big diplomatic events in the capital. You know, it's a conference. It's people come, people go. You will see it on the TV. You will see it on your phone. Or you will read about it in newspapers if you still read newspapers. But this time, that's not how it's going to happen. This time, we are going to take the G20 across the country to every state, to almost 60 cities of India. We're going to. Yesterday, Prime Minister had a meeting, virtual meeting with all the chief ministers and many of the governors. And his message to them was, this is a time to showcase India, the changes in India, the capabilities of India, the culture of India. Just ask yourself, today there's a Kashi Tamil Sangamam taking place. And I know that there are many things there which many people in Kashi would not have known had that event not happened. And probably many people in Tamil Nadu would not have known. Now, if that is the gap between two parts of India, imagine what is the gap between parts of India and the rest of the world. That today, this is an opportunity for us. That the world, it's not in our interest that the world thinks that India is Delhi. India is not Delhi. India is very much bigger than Delhi. There are many cultures, there are many, languages, obviously, there is a diversity of India. And we have this opportunity today to present the entirety of India before the world. That is what is our intention. And at the same time, because, again, one of the messages which the Prime Minister asked all his ministers to give is to ask the youth of our country in some way to find ways of joining up or supporting or relating to such events. So if something is happening in Kashi due to G20, I hope that the university at the same time would also do something which you believe is most appropriate, so that there is an association of what is happening on the world stage with what is happening in your own academic and daily life. We want G20 to be like a national celebration. We do not want it to be like a Sarkari program.